So, when all the world leaders get together to tackle climate change, what does it actually look like to the generation that's going to inherit all the consequences? Well, we're about to find out. This is a look inside the COP30 climate conference, but from a very different point of view, through the eyes of a young advocate who is right there in the middle of it all. We're getting our perspective straight from the front lines from youth activists who are out there representing organizations like the Green Students Initiative. And you got to understand, they're not just there to watch. They are there to fight for real, meaningful climate action. And believe me, they are watching every single move very, very closely. So, our guide for this is Margaret Gonga, who's a communications and advocacy coordinator from Zambia. She, along with so many other young advocates, showed up at COP30 just full of hope. They were ready to dive into these huge conversations on everything from climate finance to food systems. But then, after all the negotiations, all the closed-door meetings, that initial hope started to fade. A totally different feeling began to surface, and it wasn't unity. It was this sense of deep division. And this, right here, became the core conflict that would really define the whole experience for them. For Margaret, the single biggest takeaway really boiled down to this. This wasn't just some minor disagreement or a simple policy debate. It was a fundamental, deep-seated lack of solidarity, especially when it came to the developing countries that are, right now, facing the absolute worst impacts of the climate crisis. So what does that even mean, a lack of solidarity in the real world? To really get it, we need to pull back the curtain on the confusing world of climate finance. And we're going to do that by looking at three specific funds that, unfortunately, became symbols of broken promises. Okay, first up is the Adaptation Fund. The whole point of this fund is absolutely critical. It's not about stopping future climate change. No, this is a lifeline. It's supposed to help communities survive the impacts that are already here, the ones that are now totally unavoidable. And this is where you really see that massive gap between hope and reality. Margaret explains that the big hope was to triple this fund, to get it to $120 billion a year. A huge number, for sure, but a necessary one. The reality? Yeah, that goal was not met. Not even close. And the consequence of that is just direct and devastating. This failure is a huge setback for communities that are desperately counting on those resources to build up what Margaret calls their adaptive capacities, basically their ability to just withstand the incredibly harsh effects of a changing climate. All right, let's move on to the second fund, and you'll see how this pattern continues. This is the Global Environment Facility, or GEF. Just think of it as another huge pipeline for money designed to back all sorts of environmental projects in developing countries. Here, the hope was pretty simple. Just keep the funding at its current level or maybe even increase it. But the reality was this cloud of deep concern. Margaret points out that there were really serious worries about a potential decrease in the budget for its next cycle. A decrease. Now, to be fair, there was one small positive development. Leaders did promise to make it easier for countries to access the money. But as Margaret rightly points out, what good is a simpler application form if the total amount of money in the pot is actually getting smaller? The core issue is still there. And that brings us to our third and final fund, loss and damage. This one is for the absolute worst case scenarios. We are talking about impacts that are so severe that you can't adapt to them anymore. Things like farmland turning into irreversible desert, or entire coastlines just being swallowed by the sea. So, for this incredibly important fund, you'd think there would be some major progress, right? After all the intense debate, all the discussion, the outcome was, well, it was shockingly simple. No. Notable change. That's it. Just 3 words. But they represent a massive, massive disappointment. And as Margaret puts it, another huge cause for concern. Okay, so we've been throwing around a lot of terms. Funds, policies. It can all sound pretty abstract, right? But it is so important that we connect these decisions back to their real-world cost. It's time to shift from policy to people. Because let's be absolutely crystal clear here. This is never just about numbers on a spreadsheet or some clause in an agreement. This is about people's lives. It's about their homes, their communities, and their entire futures. And Margaret really spells it out perfectly. For vulnerable communities in her home country of Zambia and in nearby Uganda and Kenya, these funding failures mean they simply aren't going to get the resources they need to survive. The impact isn't theoretical, it's immediate, and it's life-altering. But here's the thing, this story does not end with disappointment. No way. For the young advocates at COP30, this huge setback actually became a catalyst. It forged this new sense of purpose, what we can call the youth mandate, a powerful, powerful call to action. And this right here is the critical pivot point, and it's captured perfectly by Margaret's own words. She doesn't see this as some final defeat, she sees it as an opportunity, a moment where a massive gap in leadership has created a space for a new generation to step right into. So what does stepping up actually look like in practice? Well, Margaret lays out this really clear 4-part game plan. Step 1, actively go out and step into formal leadership roles. Step 2, don't wait for some fancy title. Start being a leader in your own community right now. Step 3, use your voice to hold the current leaders accountable for all these broken promises. And finally, step 4, actively contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way, making sure youth voices aren't just in the room, but are actually shaping the final outcomes. Which leaves us with a final, pretty provocative question about the whole future of the climate movement. We've just seen a story of high hopes from a new generation being met with a lack of solidarity from the old one. So the question we're all left with is this. If the old guard is failing to deliver, is it now up to the new guard to lead the way?